big trigger warning for this episode for medical misogyny. There's only the one trigger warning, but it gets pretty bad, so please be mindful going into this. A lot of the information that I got about the history of ME, I got from a video called The Tangled Story of ME CFS: Controversy, Denigration, and Ignorance. This video is a documentary made with an award from the Wellcome Public Engagement Fund, and it features a lot of ME patients and researchers alike. It's a fantastic resource, but unfortunately it's not very well advertised. It seems to me like the only people who end up learning about ME are the people who are already looking for the sources in the first place, which is very unfortunate because accurate information desperately does need to be spread. The documentary also features a woman called Valerie Elliott Smith, who is such a legend, and I'm so excited to eventually get to talk about her. Sincerely, thank you to everyone who is part of that documentary for putting it together. If you have the time and if you're able to, please give it a watch. I'll link it in the description of this video. The history of ME is a long story with many twists and turns, but I'm going to try to do my best to keep things linear and easy to follow. The story of ME, as I'm going to tell it, starts way back on the 12th of May, 1820. This is the day that the famous nurse Florence Nightingale was born. You'll know her as the iconic Lady of the Lamp, famous for her work during the Crimean War, but what you might not know is that she was actually bedbound for much of her later life due to an unidentified illness. It's since been posited that this illness was ME. It's because of this that World ME Day falls on the 12th of May every year to commemorate her birthday. Historical documentation of ME-like illnesses, then, extends back to at least the 1800s, when Florence was alive. Due to the nature of ME and it largely being a post-viral illness, however, it's most easily historically been observed as occurring after outbreaks of infectious diseases. When a large enough group of people get infected with the same disease at the same time, and then some of them present with the same symptoms as they fail to recover, then you start to notice a pattern forming. You might be listening to this and thinking, now that sounds quite familiar. Post-viral illnesses and infectious disease outbreaks brings to mind something that we all know happened just a few years ago, something that we're still living through, and let me tell you, we will get back to that. For now, let's focus on the past. Outbreaks of an ME-like illness appeared, at least anecdotally at first, after the Russian flu pandemic that happened at the end of the 19th century, and then again after the Spanish flu outbreak. The first properly documented outbreak of an ME-like illness, however, happened at the Los Angeles County Hospital way back in 1934. From then on, documented outbreaks just kept popping up all over the world. The same ME-like illness struck people after their initial infections and left them with lasting, debilitating symptoms. This pattern remained unnamed until there was an outbreak at the nurses' quarters of the Royal Free Hospital in England in 1955. During a 5-month period from July to November, 292 members of the medical and administrative staff working there were struck by a mystery illness. 225 of them were admitted to hospital. Look, this lovely woman Edna was there herself. She can tell you all about it.
I understand I was the 234th victim, so it was fairly late on in the epidemic. They had been very certain that it had been a polio-like thing, and there were residual problems because they had found that the people who had gone back on duty, quite a number were relapsing.
1 year after this outbreak, research was published in an article in The Lancet which reflected upon this recurring pattern of a certain percentage of patients remaining sick after viral outbreaks. The name benign myalgic encephalomyelitis was offered up to describe this long-lasting mystery disease. This name essentially means inflammation of the central nervous system associated with pain. So, this is a relatively strong start for this illness. It had a name, and even though it was not fully understood, it was largely accepted to be a very real, very physical illness. In 1969, myalgic encephalomyelitis was even officially recognized by the World Health Organization and categorized as a neurological disease. Things were looking up at the time, so what could possibly have happened between then and now that led to this disease becoming so poorly understood? Well, get ready to be pissed off. It all starts with two UK psychiatrists, Colin P. McEvedy and A.W. Beard, and their review of the royal free epidemic published in the British Medical Journal in 1970, just 1 year after ME was finally recognised by the World Health Organization. McEvedy and Beard did not meet with a single patient, and based off of case notes alone, they came to the conclusion that what happened at the Royal Free Hospital was not an infectious disease outbreak, but rather an outbreak of mass hysteria. The reasoning that brought them to this conclusion, and I wish I was joking, was that most of the patients were female. I have no idea what kind of rocks these men must have had rattling around in their brains for it to come as a surprise to them that an outbreak at the female nurses' quarters of this hospital would end up mostly affecting women. I don't know why they would think that sweet Edna would lie to them, but that's what they chalked it up to. Just mass hysteria. So let's just take a step back so that we're all on the same page and talk a bit about what hysteria actually is. The word hysteria comes from ancient Greek and means wandering womb. It was given this name because back then it was believed that a person's womb was prone to feelings of wanderlust and that it would just up and travel around the body sometimes, causing different problems like anxiety, depression, tremors, even paralysis, depending on where it ended up. Hysteria has a depressingly long history, predating even its ancient Greek name. The first mentions of a hysterical quote unquote mental disorder attributable to women can be found on an ancient Egyptian papyrus text which dates back to 1900 BC. For thousands of years, at least in the Western world, women's hysteria, their emotional unpredictability and tendency to madness was pinned on that pesky womb of theirs, and cures ranging from becoming pregnant, abstinence, sedatives, exorcisms, and pleasant smelling poultices, to name a few, were offered up at different points throughout history. All the way up until the contemporary age, people believed that essentially women's wombs just got a little bit sad if they weren't filled with a baby, and that they acted out and made us go hysterical and crazy. This all changed when everyone's least favourite father of psychology, Sigmund Freud, posited that we'd got it backwards. He believed that people, not necessarily just women, were mentally unwell first, and that then resulted in expressions of hysteria. From then on, it was considered a kind of psychiatric disorder all the way up until 1980, if you can believe it, when the concept of hysterical neurosis was finally deleted with the publication of the DSM-3. Returning to McEvedy and Beard's report, my personal favourite part of it is where it reads, characteristically, epidemic hysteria occurs in populations of segregated females, in girls' schools, convents, and among female factory hands. And then there's a little asterisk and a footnote, which if you scroll down, it reads, the literature is surprisingly thin. It's not much of a surprise to me. And then it goes on to quote the research, and two of those pieces of research McEvedy himself had worked on. It seems like at least one of these psychiatrists had a kind of career interest in mass hysteria, considering their past research, and they meant to pin this outbreak of ME at the Royal Free Hospital on it too. This shitty little baseless and discriminatory report, a mere 5 pages long, would go on to sabotage future ME research in a way that would result in suffering beyond belief for an inconceivable number of ME patients, women, men, and children alike. See, this report widened a schism within the ME research community and attached a stigma to this illness that still clings to its patients and sufferers even now. This report, the doubt it cast on the validity of this illness, served as encouragement for a cohort of researchers who believed that ME, whatever it was psychosomatic or mental, not a physical biological illness. You now had two groups of researchers who each held different beliefs about the fundamental reality of this illness. On one side, you had researchers who believed that ME was a biological post-viral illness that required more biomedical research to understand, and on the other side, you had researchers who believed that it was not biological in nature and rather required effective psychological intervention to treat. Which group was right? Well, we know for sure that it's that first group. We have more than enough biomedical research by now to prove that ME is undoubtedly not psychosomatic in nature. There is a shocking number of things going wrong in these poor patients' bodies, in our immune systems, our autonomic nervous systems, our energy metabolisms. It's scary to not know what's going on in your body when you're feeling so ill, believe me. But what's even scarier is not being believed about it. This report heralds the start of a relentless movement of excessive hostility towards ME patients, both in research and beyond. Knowing what I know now, looking back at this incident honestly makes me feel like I'm sitting in a theatre watching a tragedy unfold. I'm sorry to say that this incident, this one work made by just two people, is the first in a series of fiascos that eventually leads to global medical catastrophe. The next step, then, in this timeline, or misstep, you could say, concerns the aftermath of McEvedy and Beard's report. It coincided with the rise of something called the biopsychosocial model of medicine. You might have heard of it. The biopsychosocial model was created by a man named George L. Engel in 1977 and is still widely used in medicine today. The model states that a person's state of health or unhealth is the result of an interaction between biological, psychological, and social factors, and that a patient's health outcomes cannot be determined by any one of these in isolation. In many ways, it's a very helpful model and was certainly made with good intentions. A great example of how this model could offer up a more complete picture of a patient's health is if we look at something like addiction. There's clearly a biological component in chemical addiction, in how different substances interact with the body, but there is also a psychological aspect to it concerning a person's mental health, their behaviors, coping skills. Both of these things would have an impact on a person's relationships, their social life, or maybe a stressful event in someone's personal life, like a divorce, led them to relying on drugs or alcohol in the first place. People are very complex beings who lead very complex lives, and our bodies are also very complicated. So, by acknowledging this complexity and taking a bit more of a holistic approach, this model has by and large been a positive step forward for medicine. However, it has been grossly misused to harm, not help, patients with ME. But before we move on to that, we need to look at one more outbreak, one which ended up creating just about the worst name that anyone has ever come up with for a medical condition ever. By the time a disease outbreak hit the village of Incline, Nevada, in the mid 1980s, the seeds of doubt had already well and truly been sown regarding the validity of ME as a disease. The Center of Disease Control, the CDC, did step in to investigate, though not very robustly. The CDC were reluctant to associate this outbreak directly with myalgic encephalomyelitis, despite commonalities with past outbreaks, due to concerns about how an outbreak of a disease with such a strong stigma attached to it would affect tourism in the village. Instead of confirming it to be ME, what the CDC did was essentially invent a new, infinitely shittier name for this mystery disease when they coined the term chronic fatigue syndrome in a research report published in 1988. Why was this name so awful? I'll explain that and how it ended up undermining research in the next episode.